Hello, I'm Craig Barton and welcome to this Tips for Teachers video. Now on the screen you'll see an example of a student's solution to a problem. Now you might just want to pause the video and just have a read through and see if you can spot where the student's gone wrong. I'll tell you where they've gone wrong. All this is beautiful, 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 beautiful. They've forgotten the flipping units. Now, if this was an exam paper, that's going to cost them 1 mark, a precious 1 mark. And the interesting thing here is they've done all the hard work. The easiest thing in the world is just to stick centimetres squared on the end of that, but they've forgotten the units. I, for many years, would categorise that as a silly mistake. And how would I help my students eradicate it? I'd write something like, don't be so silly, or big pair of glasses or something like that for watch out. And it'd be so frustrating for me as a teacher, but equally frustrating for my students. Now the thing is with maths, and I wonder if this is true of other subjects, there are loads of examples of these so-called silly mistakes. Here are some for maths: forgetting the units, as we've just seen there, forgetting to round your answer. You do all the complicated calculations and the question says round your answer to 2 decimal places and you forget to do it. Forgetting to finish the question is an interesting one. The question's asked you perhaps for the area of 2 things, but you forget to add them together at the end. Or you forget to simplify the fraction to finish things off. You don't quite go all the way to finishing. Or a classic, you forget to check whether the answer's sensible. You do all this kind of complicated work, you get to an answer which is like 28 million and it can't possibly be right, but the students still just write it down. Now all those are examples of things that previously I would have categorised as silly mistakes. But now I'm not so sure. And once we start to move away from the notion that they're perhaps not silly mistakes and get to the root cause, well then we can potentially help our students eradicate them. So here's my theory for mistakes like this. Notice where they appear in the solution part of a problem. They all appear at the end. They're the final step. Putting the units in, rounding your final answer, finishing the question. It's all the last thing students do. Now, if we just go to a model of working memory that we've used in many of these Tips for Teachers videos, the problem here is that students have got a finite amount of attention. If all their attention has been consumed getting to that final stage, they've simply nothing left to finish the process off. A phrase I like to use is, I'm not sure this is technical, they're cognitively knackered. They're like, so they simply have nothing left in the tank of attention to add those units, to finish, to remember to round, to finish the question off and so on. So me saying, what a silly mistake, check your work and all that, an absolute waste of time. So the question is, how can we help our students? Well, there are 2 ways, both of which are going to involve easing the burden on working memory. One thing we can do is we can make sure that students are as fluent as possible in the steps leading up to that final stage. So they practice doing all the area calculations so it's not as cognitively demanding. But I also think we can do something quite interesting with that final stage. What we can do is we can isolate it. We can isolate and practice that final step. So it's that becomes automatic. So if students are cognitively knackered by that stage of the process, it's not as big a burden for them just to put the units in or remember to round and so on and so forth. I'll show you an example of what I mean. So let's take that circle example that we looked at the start. Now all students needed to do to get that final mark was remember the right units. But by the time they got to that point in the question, that was quite troublesome, quite a burden for them to do. So what we can do is we can isolate that final stage in the process. So what I will do, and this is part of my notion of atomization, before I even teach my students how to work out the area or circumference of a circle, what I want them doing is taking a look at a question like that and deciding what the units of the answer will be. They don't know how to work out the answer, but they've enough knowledge of parts of a circle and perimeter and area to decide that, the units of that answer must be meters squared. And then I'm going to use my principle of intelligent practice, where the next description of a question I'm going to give them is just going to change one thing. So notice what's changed there. Notice the units have changed from meters to centimeters. So what would the units of the answer be there to that question? Not how to work out the answer, but what would the units be? Well, they'd be centimeters squared. So now let's change something again. Notice what I've changed there. What impact's that going to have on our answer? Okay, now let's change something else. What impact's that going to have on our answer? That's always important, I think, whenever something changes in the question but the answer doesn't change. I think that really challenges students. It seems to be human nature to think a change in the input leads to a change in the output. And this can continue. Now, I've spoken about this previously. I'd probably do this on mini whiteboards. I think this is a good idea. I put up the description. I say, write down your units, hover your board, 3, 2, 1, show me, and I can check, and I can have conversations if there's differences. The kids can do partner talk and so on and so forth. But notice none of this requires a calculation. So all students' attention is focused on that final step. And if we can get that final step to the point where it's completely automated, or it's as cognitively less burdensome as possible, then hopefully students are less likely to forget to include it. I should say, by the way, just to finish this off, what I also like to do whenever I've done a sequence of questions or examples like this, is I like to throw it back to the student. So write me a circles question where the answer would be millimetres, write it where it would be millimetres squared, and so on and so forth. But as a general principle, what do you think of that? This notion that actually silly mistakes may not be so silly, and that there is potentially a way to eradicate them once we understand the root cause of them. Do you like that idea? Is that something you could apply to your subject or a topic that you've got coming up? What do you think?